And now we begin part 2.
While Charles and his forces settled around Dorpat for winter quarters, news of his victory at Narva created shockwaves throughout Europe. Peter the Great, realizing that Augustus II might already be trying to enter peace negotiations with Sweden, offered the Saxon elector financial and military help in return for staying in the war. By the beginning of the campaigning season, in May, reinforcements from Sweden arrived in Revel, and they joined the main Swedish army in the middle of June. Having united his forces, Charles set off for Riga on June 17th. However, as the Russians frequently raided and harassed Swedish positions, he was forced to leave behind 6,000 men in Ingria and Estonia under the command of Schlippenbach. Although the Saxon army besieged Riga from the beginning of the war, they did not have the manpower or the equipment to take the well-fortified city. After learning of the arrival of the Swedish army in Livonia in late 1700, the Saxon troops retreated beyond the Duna River, modern Daugava, for winter quarters. During the winter season, the Saxons, under the command of Steinau, heavily fortified their side of the river in preparation for a possible Swedish crossing. The Swedish army arrived near Riga on July 14th, and Charles, being aware that making a direct crossing would be a huge risk and quite costly in manpower, opted to weaken the Saxon defense first. Several hundred of his horsemen, as well as part of Riga's garrison, were ordered to head upriver towards Kockenhusen, a seemingly ideal place for a crossing. As a result, Steinau was forced to stretch his forces thin to cover both the possible crossing points at Kockenhusen and the one near Riga. On the evening of the 18th, Swedish forces embarked on transport ships at Fassenholm and began their crossing. Meanwhile, engineers were ordered to create a makeshift floating bridge across the river as well. The crossing Swedish army, led by Charles himself, consisted of around 7,000 grenadiers and only 100 cavalry, while their Saxon counterpart had a 20,000 strong army on their side. As soon as
Dang, the numbers once again, you know. I will say, I'll comment quickly, I like Peter the Great, what he did in keeping Saxony, you know, the Saxons, Augustus, in the war. I think that was a smart move, because if they had made peace, then Russia would have been a little more alone, so that was a good move on his part. I wanted to comment on that. And yeah, once again, like Charles defeated the estimated 30 to 40,000 Russian army with only 9,000 men, and now here he has 7,000 against 20,000. I'm looking forward to seeing. I think he might just win again. So I'm looking forward to seeing his skill and how he's gonna pull this off. You know.
As the transport boats reached the middle of the river, the Saxon artillery started firing at them. However, the artillery barrage would be ineffective. At the same time, the Swedish artillery, placed both on their side of the river and on 2 riverboats, began shelling the Saxon redoubts. Awaiting the Swedish assault, a Saxon army under the command of Steinau drew up in 2 lines between the 2 redoubts. The army that Steinau managed to gather in such a short period of time consisted only of about 3,500 men, and it was made up mostly of infantry and a small amount of cavalry on the flanks. Charles, seeing that such a force was descending upon his men, drew up around 3,000 grenadiers and prepared for the Saxon assault. The Saxons attacked the Swedish army furiously, however their assault was halted, and they were forced to retreat after the Swedish army fired several volleys. This allowed for more Swedish troops to disembark and join the main body of the army, while at the same time, more of Steinau's men joined the fight as well. Undaunted by their initial failure, the entirety of the Saxon infantry drew up in a line and charged, meeting the same fate once again. On their 3rd try, the Saxon cavalry tried to attack Charles's right flank. However, a part of the Swedish cavalry that just disembarked managed to push it back. This pattern of Saxon assaults and retreats dragged on until 7 AM on the next day, when the Swedish army captured the first redoubt. Steinau deemed it impossible to defend such a position and subsequently ordered a retreat. The majority of the Saxon army retreated unscathed to the forts of Dunemunda and Kobrin.
Dang. Again, the Swedish are, very impressive so far. And yeah, just a great resistance. Usually when you have, a body of water to your back, you're kind of at a disadvantage, especially if you could be pushed back. But they held firm, which is just super impressive. Like I said, it's just not the most advantageous position to be in, but they came out on top.
As bad weather prevented the Swedish engineers from finishing the bridge in time so that their cavalry could assault the Saxon army. Still, the Saxons lost more than 2,000 in this action, while Charles's casualties were around 500. In the following days, Kobbrun and Dunemunda fell to the Swedish army, with Kockenhusen and the rest of Livonia and Kurland falling into their hands in the next few weeks. A small Russian army under Repnin that was sent by Peter to support the Saxons retreated to the east without participating in the battle. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been neutral up until that point, with the majority of their magnates opposing the war with Sweden and using the liberum veto to avoid it. Charles himself was in a position of power at that moment and could have signed a peace treaty with Augustus. Aware of the elector's deceitful nature, the young Swedish king knew that there would be no peace with Poland for as long as Augustus remained king. Therefore, dethroning him seemed like the only option to secure Livonia and advance to Russia unhindered. It is also speculated that Charles had taken a personal disliking towards Augustus, as the two of them had quite opposite personalities. The Polish-Lithuanian
How are you gonna overthrow him? Like, how are you planning on handling that, Charles? I mean, I agree with Charles. Obviously, Augustus and Peter straight up lied at the beginning. They were like, yeah, we're peaceful before declaring war, which was so backstabby. So, yeah, obviously, I agree with him. They can't be trusted, but, like, now he, wants to overthrow? Like, set up someone new? Like, how are you gonna do that?
Commonwealth was far from what it once was. The cracks on the internal political machine of the state were evident. Many of the magnates did not support their elected king, and some were even openly against him. In the beginning of autumn in 1701, as soon as Charles started advancing into Kurland, he was met by several minor Lithuanian nobles, asking him to avoid taking control of their lands in exchange for their logistical support. Lithuania was, at the time, divided between two powerful noble families, the Oginsky and the Sapieha. Augustus himself was at odds with the Sapieha family and allowed the Oginsky to raid their lands with impunity. The two counts of Sapieha, seeing an opportunity to protect their lands and expand their influence, met with Charles as well, offering their support in exchange for protection against Oginsky and the dethroning of Augustus.
In Australia, today's the start of every good adventure. Yep, it's amazing.
Although minor Swedish expeditions took place in Lithuania in the last few months of 1701, with Kaunas and Vilnius falling by January, no significant result was achieved, as Oginsky refused to give open battle and was still harassing the Swedish forces. By February of 1702, Charles returned to Kurland and started making preparations for his advance on Warsaw. Seeing the gravity of the situation, Augustus called for a diet in the capital, asking the Polish nobility for support. The diet did not resolve any crucial issues, with many magnates using that chance to voice their dissatisfaction with Augustus. Nevertheless, the nobility agreed to send 5 of their members to Charles to try and negotiate a peace once again, this time with the Dutch Republic's mediation. The 5 diplomats, some nobles and some members of the Catholic Church, met with Charles on several occasions. the divisions in the ranks of the Commonwealth were seen here as well. At first, the diplomats tried to convince Charles to agree to their peace terms. However, after several days, they started bickering among themselves, much to the Swedish king's annoyance. Incensed by their disrespect, Charles halted all further negotiations and moved for Warsaw, determined to take it. Having learned of the Swedish king's inflexibility, Augustus decided to leave Warsaw for the old capital of Krakow. With Warsaw falling to the Swedes by late spring, Augustus attempted a last-ditch effort to secure peace and sent the Archbishop of Gniezno, Cardinal Radziejowski. Unknown to Augustus, the cardinal had already exchanged several letters with Charles, assuring him of his friendly intentions. Whether the cardinal intended to betray Augustus at that point still remains unclear. Furthermore, after spending some time with Charles, the cardinal advised him against dethroning the king, as the Polish people would not only change their attitude towards the Swedes, but also that they would never view the new king as legitimate. As Augustus still was not decisively defeated, Charles did not give too much thought to the cardinal's advice, but focused on the war instead. It was the middle of...
So yeah, I do agree with the cardinal's proposal there. First of all, there is... yeah, getting rid of the monarch, it's like replacing him. We've seen that, kind of like what Napoleon did. It's not a popular thing. I don't think there would be a lot of legitimacy. So that's why I'm a bit worried about this ambition to overthrow him, you know. But obviously keeping him around is another issue entirely, because he's proven not a man of his word, so... that's a bit of a messy situation, and Charles is having to deal with the Polish cracks or disunity. And it's funny because in Lithuania he took advantage of the two warring noble houses and essentially used it for his advantage, and that was really smart. Like, I think when an enemy is not united, you divide and conquer. And I think that's what Charles needs to do. Divide and conquer through Polish, disunity. And so far I think he's looking for that final decisive battle, he said. So I think he won't be satiated until he does get that battle. But so far he's doing well, and it's because, like, again, Poland seems to have its own issues right now. Its nobility, and we've seen in history nobility kind of having issues with the monarchs. So yeah, it seems like there's a lot going on here.
June, when Charles began his march towards Krakow. He reached the town of Kielce, where he learned that Augustus linked up with the Polish army under Lubomirski at Sandomierz. After an unsuccessful Saxon ambush on a Swedish scouting unit, the Swedes learned of Augustus's position at Kliszow. On the morning of the 17th of July, Charles departed from Kielce at the head of his army, reaching the village of Opiece, which was 4 kilometers away from Kliszow, on the evening of the same day. Even though the Swedish army was smaller and lacked cavalry, Charles wanted to attack. Ultimately, he heeded the advice of his generals and waited for one more day for his cavalry to arrive. As the Swedish cavalry arrived on the...
Yeah, that's good, because I'm like, you're gonna attack without cavalry? Like, that's insane, Charles. But yeah, that was good. I was about to be like, dude, you should wait for the cavalry. I was about to say that. Thank goodness I waited. Yeah, Charles, he's a real go-getter, but you're gonna need cavalry support. Everyone always needs cavalry support, you know? So yeah, overall, that was good. It seems he can listen to other people's advice, which is good.
The 18th, so did rumors about a Saxon attack, which was supposed to take place on the morning of the 19th. However, the Saxon army had not turned up by 9 AM, so Charles drew up his army and began marching towards their positions at Kliszow. He had roughly 12,000 men at his disposal, with about 8,000 grenadiers and 4,000 cavalry, as well as 4 artillery pieces. The army was drawn up in 2 lines. The cavalry was placed on the wings and the infantry in the centre. The right wing was commanded by Charles XII himself, the centre by von Leeuwen, and the left wing by Duke Frederick IV of Holstein-Gottorp. The majority of the Swedish army advanced through the forest towards Kliszow, with only the left wing taking the more open route. Just as the Swedish left arrived on the plains outside Kliszow, they were noticed by a Saxon cavalry regiment that was led by Augustus. As the Saxon Elector was confident that only a small unit was advancing towards his positions, he lowered his guard and did not take the threat seriously. Charles, seeing the element of surprise as critical, ordered his cavalry to lower their standards and the infantry to lower their pikes, just as they passed onto the plains outside Kliszow. Augustus fell for that trap as well, and perceived the Swedish army as only a reconnaissance unit. The Saxon army consisted of 16,000 men, 9,000 of whom were infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Augustus also had an 8,000 strong Polish cavalry unit, consisting of 1,000 elite winged hussars, 3,000 panzerni, 500 dragoons, and 3,500 Cossacks and Wallachian light horse.
Dude, that armor looks cool, like the winged effect. Like, if that's actually how it looked, that's pretty awesome. I'm just kind of admiring it. And once again, Charles does not have the numerical superiority, though he does have the advantage of kind of hiding his numbers, giving his enemies an even greater false sense of superiority, right?
The army of Augustus also had the majority of its infantry in the center and the cavalry on the flanks. The left wing was led by von Tremper, the center by Schulenberg, and the right by von Flemming, while the Polish units on the far right were led by Lubomirski. Augustus's forces occupied the higher ground, where they placed their 46 artillery pieces, and their position was also additionally protected by a chevaux de frise. At noon, Charles ordered his right wing to pass around the woodlot in front of it from the left side, also the centre and left wing to advance directly towards the Saxon positions. Now aware that this was not just a reconnaissance unit, but the main Swedish army, Augustus ordered his artillery to fire on the Swedish forces. Right before the Saxon camp, there was a dense marsh from the village of Kokot to the village of Vyszbica, which hindered the Swedish advance. The Saxons were in a very advantageous position at that point, their artillery wreaking havoc upon the Swedish army. Charles XII, seeing the absolute impossibility of attacking the enemy directly, ordered his army to wheel to the left, thereby taking higher ground and disengaging from the marshes. The Saxon army, now being forced to draw towards the right, left its advantageous positions on the high ground, and a part of it ended up in the marshes instead. At 2 p.m, the Swedish left wing began its attack. Just as Frederick IV was marching towards the Polish cavalry, he was struck by a cannonball and was taken to his tent, where he would die a few hours later. Now commanded by Welling, the Swedish left still charged the Polish cavalry thrice, completely crushing even the winged hussars and forcing the entire wing to rout. Afterwards, Charles took control of the left and began advancing towards the Saxon center. To avoid...
Wow, that's amazing. So the Saxons have the advantageous high ground position, and Charles essentially the Swedish march right into disadvantage and get kind of like wrecked there, but then immediately just turn over here, causing some of them to leave their advantageous position, and then now the entire tide has turned. That's insane. Like, wow, that's impressive. There's a simple, I'm gonna move right here now. I'm gonna go further left, and that disrupted everything.
Being outflanked, the Saxon center began a retreat. However, they exposed themselves to the elite Swedish infantry in the center, which began firing destructive volleys at them, dealing massive casualties. The Saxon retreat was made even more difficult by the marshland which was behind their initial position, and the Swedish soldiers used that opportunity to shoot as many of them down as possible. On the other side of the battlefield, the Saxon cavalry attacked the Swedish right wing. Though the Saxons initially had the upper hand there, they were repulsed by the Swedish right and were forced to retreat. As the main Saxon army had already routed, their left ran into the rest of the Swedish army on their retreat. The Saxon left bravely fought to escape from their encirclement. However, they lost many men.
Dude, they literally walked into an encirclement. That's insane. Yo, this is... Wow, the Swedish are really impressive at this point. Like I said, I didn't know anything about the Swedish. This was well done.
To the fire from the Swedish infantry in the process. In the end, the winning Swedish army lost less than 1,000 men, while the Saxons lost 3,700, 1,700 of whom were captured. The exact number of Polish casualties is unknown, however they are noted to have been great. The Swedish army also ended up in possession of the 46 Saxon artillery pieces and their war chest. Augustus's downplaying of the danger which the Swedish army posed to his own cost him the advantageous initial position. That, combined with the superiority of the Swedish soldiers and Charles's tactical acumen, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the Saxon-Polish army. Augustus retreated with what was left of his army to Sandomierz, hoping to get more support from the Diet there, while on the 31st of July, Charles entered Krakow. The Battle of Kliszow marked the last time that the famed winged hussars were used in battle. Symbolically, it would also mark the beginning of the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
And as we know, Polish gets essentially absorbed by everyone. So yeah, that's sad the hussars are done. Like I said, I was admiring their armor, they just looked cool.
This decisive victory brought Charles one step closer to a complete victory, which seemed impossible less than 2 years ago.
Okay, so this will be the end of part 2. We'll carry on into part 3 next time. Bye everyone.